Okay, before I get started, I just wanted to say that, yes, I'm an assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz. It is the most striking campus. It's very beautiful. Also, our graduate student labor strike is still going on. If you're not aware of that, I encourage you to check it out at paysmoreucsc.com or at paysmoreucsc on Twitter. Maybe we can link that in chat. The labor activities are still going on, and currently, even during a pandemic, our chancellor and EVC are spending resources to still implement punitive measures against graduate students and undergraduate students who participated in strike activities, which includes some of those punishments can include losing access to your housing, having to move, and of course, access to healthcare in a global pandemic during a shelter-in-place order. So I just want to make everyone aware that that is still going on. And so today, the way I wanted to structure this is I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which my art practice has shifted. It's going through a shift at this point, which is really exciting and thrilling for me to talk about with all of you. So I kind of want to show maybe the inception point where I felt like my practice really started to shift in the new directions. And so that's what I'm going to do. So let's see. Share my screen. So just to give a little bit of, can everyone see that? Is that working? Okay, great. All right, let me do some window management here. So I'm going to start with an older project that actually kind of stresses me out to talk about this work because it's being reissued and it's really behind. So a little anxiety here, but I think it's an important sort of baseline to start with. I've been describing my work as sort of agency work. My goals as an artist have always been to maximize agency for marginalized bodies, really primarily starting with my own. I had a non-traditional path to university, to the academy, and to being a professor at this point. And so a lot of what I was confronting as I sort of navigated different socioeconomic hierarchies was this entire first, confronting and sort of overcoming external barriers. And then as I sort of, reached spaces that were more affluent, confronting those internalized barriers, confronting my own anti-Blackness, interrogating my own sexuality and gender identity. Thinking of my work as agency work is not, it's a somewhat unsatisfying title. I really think of it as a placeholder. I think what I really want to call it is liberation work, but because my practice has been so personal and about my own personal liberation, I felt like that wasn't really, like I couldn't claim that because liberation is really systemic. It's about uplifting a community. It's not something that happens at the individual level. So I want to share this piece, and then I want to share, like I said, that sort of turning point where I think maybe I'm moving more into a meaningful social practice and maybe approaching that liberation work. So this is a piece that's several years old. It's called Objectif. I'm not going to play the video. I'm just going to show. It's a pretty simple game. It's a deck of cards for those of you who are familiar with, social party games like Cards Against Humanity or Apples to Apples. It plays very similar to that. It has that judging mechanic where one person's a judge, other players are sort of placing these cards and they're trying to get them chosen. Right, that's how you win the round. In Objectif, as you can see, all of the cards are hand illustrated portraits of women. All of these cards are meant to be drawn as Black women, and it was actually a game that was prompted, I designed it as a response to an article that was published in 2011 called, the title was, "Why Are Black Women Less Physically Attractive Than Other Races?" And it was published on Psychology Today's website, fairly popular, well-known journal. And so, I saw that title, I read the article, it was filled with sort of scientific racism, these very thin justifications for misogynoir. And I didn't really take issue with that so much. That wasn't interesting to me. There are plenty of people with PhDs who are racist and sexist and use, their background and experience and their credentials, the sort of credibility that goes along with that to perpetuate racism and sexism. But what I really found interesting in that article was the comment section. And, this is pre-2016 where, if you're a person who's very online, like I was, I grew up on the internet, the idea that you would take a comment section seriously was still sort of like, that's just comments, they're meaningless. But they weren't meaningless to me. I knew that what I saw in the comment section of that article revealed something deeper about our society and our culture. So what I saw was not people saying, oh my gosh, Black women are so ugly, I'm racist and I'm terrible, even though those people were. What I saw throughout those comments was a sense of relief that, oh, okay, it's not that I'm racist, right? Like, I don't find Black women attractive, and it's scientific. It's not me. It's not that I'm a bad person. And I was really interested in that idea of how do I sort of talk to people who are interested in who don't think of themselves as racist, who hold implicit biases, and maybe want to do better, but don't have a context to explore that, to have certain conversations or unpack that. So I ended up making this game, which again, is all about choosing the most attractive woman. The way that works is the judge has to, the distinguishing factor between this game and some of those other party games is that it holds the players accountable. You're implicated. The judge has to explain to players why they're choosing, you know, say this card over this card. And so it opens up a dialogue, and it gets people to explicitly state this sort of process around attraction and cultural norms and like colorism that otherwise is sort of happening in the background and isn't brought to the fore. So, you know, I talk about this piece because it was a pretty important work for me, but it also had a sort of, there's a sense of distance here. And I still think about if this work is like who this work is for, if I'm making work that, you know, I'm making work that is built off of a marginalized community, but isn't necessarily for that community. And I take a lot of issue with sort of building work about marginalization that has been sort of served to a more privileged audience. And I'll say that this work doesn't entirely do that. And, you know, it's not that simple. It exists in multiple spaces, but it's something, there's sort of this thought that I've had for the last few years. And so I'm going to show some of my other work that I think also has maybe some of these issues or these concerns. So, okay, again, thinking about agency, most of what I've done in terms of agency has manifested in this idea of identity and representation. Yeah, I tend to have this thing where I talk about my work in the most problematic ways because I think that's what's interesting to me. Work that just feels clean and neat and I've done it, I'm not as interested in. So you'll hear me sort of like nitpick my own work a lot because that's part of my process. So thinking again about the body, representation and agency, I'm just gonna play this piece and then I'll talk about it afterward. So I feel like this was a real turning point in my work where in terms of Objectif was something that, you know, I'm a light-skinned Black woman, I benefit from like light-skinned privilege, I benefit from colorism. I know that I've had doors open for me because I have a certain like palatability to a white standard. And so making Objectif, even though it's about Black women, there's still, you know, this kind of distance for me. I didn't feel as sensitive. I wasn't, you know, putting my own body on the line in that way. Whereas in Art Show, this AR piece that I released on Snapchat, it was like a 24-hour pop-up. This is the most vulnerable work I had done at this point. It's actually my body. I've never been nude in a work before. The idea of broadcasting myself in this way, the context in which it was made. I think I'm 30 here. You know, it's like sort of, I was navigating, what am I allowed to be? What is the Black woman's body allowed to be? What is a woman's body allowed to be on the internet? I'm thinking about gays here. But yeah, I'm just gonna play it. And can I just get like a thumbs up to make sure the sound is working?
This is fucking amazing. What a beautiful face I have found in this place that is circling all around the sun.
You can get this now or later. Now or later. It's your choice. Whoa, stop playing. You acting like I don't do this. Build it.
Okay. So one of the reasons why this work was important for me is, when I talk about sort of traversing these socioeconomic hierarchies, a lot of that process for me was about trying to attain a certain level of respectability, to prove that I was worth something to our greater society and to myself. And, I think there's a little bit of Kanye in me, in that, there's that line, as soon as they like you, make them unlike you. Well, Objectif was a pretty widely received work. I think it was my first finished game. It won a couple of awards. It was very palatable. Like too many people liked it, and that frustrated me. I think I felt like, why is that? Is it making people too comfortable? Because I'm really concerned about doing this kind of work that sort of circles around this idea of empathy work that allows people to feel complacent, to feel comfortable, to feel like they played a game, so they've done the work and they understand, because that's not how that works. And so I think, this piece was created a year or two after my M.F.A. And so I sort of attained this level of respectability and these credentials. And I felt really like, oh my gosh, I'm this person in the world. And yeah, so I thought, well, what could I do? Well, what am I afraid of? What would make me feel like I could lose all of this respectability? Well, I could put my tits on the internet. I could do that. And there's more to this piece, but I'll let you read about that on my website if you're curious. It really was about a reclamation of the body, but there were so many things that were going into that, about like that reclamation, not just being about my physical body and being a part of like past trauma and abuse, but also reclamation from this idea that, through moving through these hierarchies, that now I was still only allowed to be one kind of thing, that my Black femme body was still only allowed to exist in a particular way, and that I couldn't sort of transgress any of these new boundaries. Let's see. So then again, thinking further about embodiment, at the same time that I released that piece, I was doing a residency at Laboratory Spokane. And I was working on a piece, I think this is maybe it's my second VR piece, third VR piece, I don't know, something. It was still pretty early in VR though. And so I was working on a piece called In Passing. And I had a fairly simple, what I thought was going to be a simple concept and a simple process. And I wanted to make a piece that was about navigating public space based on the bodies that we are in, and sort of our self-identifications and the ways in which we were perceived by others. And as we know, there's often a rift between those two things. And so I wanted to explore that. And this piece started by me soliciting basically personal narratives from people, friends on Facebook. I posted online somewhere. And the piece really fundamentally changed. It sort of broke me, broke my process when I started making this work, because when I received the responses, I just sent out a Google form, but the responses I received really indicated to me that people had, been holding on to these stories, or maybe people had never been asked this question, and they really wanted to express what it was like just to be in the world as who they are. And I wanted to, I solicited these narratives from an actual, like a diverse group of folks, not diversity as, as it's usually coded as like, okay, Black and brown folks and women, but actually like, yes, like straight, cis, white men. Thought it was really important to have that breadth of experience, especially when it comes to navigating public space, because, we know that we don't all have equal access to public space. We don't all have the same right to be present in the world, and whether that's feeling safe or anything else. And I was actually very surprised, not only with the depth of responses, but how different people's experiences were, that maybe I thought they would be more simplistic, and then there was a lot of depth, because again, perception is not the same as self-identification. So I'm gonna play just a little bit of this piece, just to give you a sense of what it was like.
My name is A.M. Darke, and you're experiencing my work in passing. I'm now going to read the list of credits
So
from people
I'm
who
a
contributed to it.
white, cis, able-bodied woman, and I'm 24 years old, and walking in public, either alone or with other women, or with other women, is always
I never leave the house without my keys. I don't want to lock myself out. It's been a while now. 20 years ago, I had this crazy guy. He was my arch nemesis, and he found my keys because they fell out of my pocket somehow, and it just made me feel like I wasn't in control of my life. So ever since then, I have a chain that I clip to my belt that has my house keys. So that's one thing. When I leave the house, that's always clipped to me. And I never leave the house unless
Okay, so the main thing that kind of dominates my experience of public spaces is becoming super self-aware about my own gaze, and like wondering what it's doing when I look at different people. So to give an example, I actually remember what I think is the first time I encountered like a black person in public. I think it's the first time. I don't know. I must have been a very sheltered child, but
Okay, so there's a few things happening in this work. There's a few technological things. So, and this I want to show this work, and I want to show the follow-up for two different reasons. But this is sort of the work that was the precursor to the research that I'm currently doing for a project called the Open Source Afro Hair Library, which I'll talk about. That'll be the last thing I talk about because it's really exciting, and I'm going to do like a little demo. But basically, what I'm doing here is I'm finding ready-made models. For those of you who do 3D work or have worked in games, I'm using Mixamo here. You'll recognize some of these, like, you know, these bodies. They're pretty easy. You can basically use like a character creation system to make a character based on these 3D scans they've done of real people. And then you can get them auto-rigged, and you can add all these animations. And so pretty simple process if you, can't do all of that from scratch. And with that character creation system, I'm sort of stretching things as far as they can go to try to get variation and creating lots of different characters, even with a sort of limited tool set. And then, as you can see, I'm using these. I had people record the narratives on video, and then I'm just superimposing those videos over the mouth area, because that really solves the whole like blend shapes, like syncing audio to like 3D renderings of a mouth. In this process, I created quite a few characters, and they look pretty distinct. I've given them different clothes that are customized, and hair colors, and accessories. But one of the things that I really noticed was for Black characters, it was difficult to, like, you could see how they were basically the same model, mostly because the hair options were so limited for the Black characters. There were only, I think, 2 or 3 hair options that felt like explicitly coded as Black, maybe only 2. And one of them was, of course, like locks, like, and then, which there's like, I think the one at the end shows this, maybe. Or is it the starting video? If I go back, it'll show it. So there's locks, and then there was a sort of kind of Rachel Dolezal kind of afro, but not even really an afro. So there were limitations there. And I'll go back to that. So the other issue with this project is that it was interesting, but it was long, and it was a VR piece. And I think the entire piece is something like 20 minutes. That's a long time to spend, especially at this version of a VR headset. And I thought, what does it do? It's telling people stories. I think, I said this sort of broke my process when I received the stories from people, because I'm not a documentarian. I had never worked with this material before, and I honestly didn't know how to effectively edit down these narratives. They felt so precious, they felt so important that I didn't want to touch them. And I really struggled with that, which meant that this was a long piece. that felt maybe less focused than some of my other work. And at the end of the day, it felt like, well, people who engaged with this work wanted to listen to all of the stories. And also there's a sort of, you know, there's a gamer aesthetic here where there's a completionist aspect of, well, you want to win the game by listening to all the stories. But what do you get? It's sort of like, well, listen to 20 minutes worth of sort of slow dialogue, and now I'm a better person. Like, is it like, oh, I endured the sad stories or the complex narratives, and therefore I'm better than the person who didn't care or who took the headset off or didn't feel like listening to all of these real people. And so again, I'm circling around this idea of the empathy game and, like, you know, VR as the empathy machine. And I didn't have a solution yet. I didn't have a solution for, you know, making that kind of sort of contrived empathy work. But what I did have was at least a way to respond to it with humor, because that's what I do when I don't have an answer. And so here's in passing version 2. This was shown at Ars Electronica, part of the Feminist Climate Change Beyond the Binary show. And I will show you, I'll speed through this and get to the ARVR library.
Recently, I had a discussion with some coworkers, some Canadian and American coworkers of mine, about the general safety differences between here in Sweden and over there, and about how generally it's much safer here, but we still operate under the assumption that at any point as women, we're going to be attacked. And so we talked about the different things that we do when we are walking alone in public spaces.
So what's happening here? Basically, this piece includes only women and non-binary folks, and you know, it's a lot more focused of a piece. And if you listen to each story, like, right, going back to the idea of the empathy game or being a good person because you listen to the narratives,
in public, either alone or with other women.
I wanted to push that further. So in this piece, if you go around to each of the podiums, as you listen to the story, they rise. This is sort of a cheat version. So if you listen to each story, they rise, and if you make it to the end of the story, then a cookie pops out of the podium. And so for those of you who are familiar with sort of social justice discourse, the idea of like ally theater, or, you know, folks who they, you know, weren't absolutely terrible.
I'm genderqueer and transmasculine, which means I was assigned.
I'm playing on that notion. So if you listen to all of these stories and you make it to the end, if you collect all of your ally cookies for being a wonderful person, let's see. Oh, maybe I can't show this. Sorry, my video is just being kind of choppy. So if you collect all of the cookies, then at the end, the secret panel is opened in the gallery and a bunch of milk pours out. And then that's me there clapping for you because, like, good job, you did it, right? You're super woke. So that is how I responded with that piece again. Still trying to think of, right, like, I'm doing this work that deals with marginalized communities, but like, what is the actual impact? How do I sort of, you know, get past that hump of just like revealing our pain or revealing our experiences? So in doing the research for that project, I started thinking about, for the in passing works, right, I'm starting to think about the limitations of Black representation in digital media. And this is where the idea for the open source ARVR library came from. And I think I'm just going to read a little bit about it because I like the statement. So I'm just going to read the statement. Currently, there's a limited representation of Black people in games and digital media. In real life, natural Black hair is considered a liability in academic and professional settings, with Black people being subject to loss of employment, school suspension, or even having their hair forcibly removed before being allowed to compete as athletes. These are all true stories that you can look up. Across digital media, accurate and diverse depictions of Black hairstyles and textures are generally confined to NBA sports video games, but even that representation is only of Black male players. Outside of these basketball video games, Black people, regardless of gender, are often portrayed in ways that are derogatory, inaccurate, stereotypical, demeaning, and otherwise harmful if they are depicted at all. So the idea for the open source ARVR library is that it would be a free, user-friendly, curated database of 3D models of Afro hair textures and styles. And the reason why I wanted to create this database was basically to deal with, you know, what Sophia Noble would call technological redlining that exists in the current 3D market asset places. So what do I mean by technological redlining? Well, if you're familiar with algorithms of oppression, part of what Sophia talks about is that when she was doing the research for that led to that book, if you did a Google search for Black girls, you would find pornographic images. If you did a Google search for white girls, you would find what you should expect, right? Playful, happy little white girls, right? Like nothing that's sort of coded in a demeaning way along the lines of race and gender. So, you know, that book has been out for a while. I'm, you know, familiar with the work, and yeah, I see it surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, continue to be reproduced specifically in 3D media. So I want to give you an example of this. There's two issues. Let's say, you know, I want to make a 3D project and I want to use some Black folks and I want to use Black hair. That's usually what I'm looking for, is like a diversity of Black hairstyles. If you go to CJ Trader, which I'm just going to do right now, everyone can see this? Cool. So there's two issues that I outline when I talk about the Afro hair library, and one is a query issue. It's how do you search for Black hair, right? Like, what does that mean? So if I search for Black hair, as you can see, okay, Black hair. That's not the Black hair I want. That's not going on my head. I know my hair is straight today, but I want options. So, you know, you've got a beard, you've got this office woman, a wolf, a cow, some bears. Okay, here's an afro that kind of looks like a weird helmet. That's not the representation that I want. More animals. Okay, this guy has hair. Not really hair, I guess. So you can just sort of see, right, like already Black hair doesn't mean anything to this particular algorithm. This site doesn't know what I mean by Black hair. Let's go to Turbo Squid. Turbo Squid, Black hair, horse, another horse. And then this particular model, which brings up some other issues. All right, let's say I did want a long Black anime wig. I don't necessarily want that wig on a hypersexualized model of ambiguous age. This is not what I'm looking for, you know, as a person trying to make like feminist work. Oh no. So again, you see some irrelevant results. And then the results that you see when you do see Black people, not necessarily focused on hair, there's sort of these caricatures, these sort of archetypes. You also aren't seeing very many Black women. Again, like if I'm looking for hair, I don't see a lot of like diversity in terms of hairstyles, right? So the first one's a query issue. And then if you go to the Unity Asset Store, Black hair, well, the first result is police officers, which I would like to avoid police at all costs, even in a digital realm. So I don't want to see that. And human race pack, right? Pretty generic. So I say, okay, and you know, I tried out a bunch of different search terms, right? Just trying to figure out what's the one to get what I want. So I figured Afro hair would be the safest. And then the results get a little bit better. Okay, this person has, you know, like that's, you know, a Black ethnic hair texture, fine. But then you have things like this, which I'm not going to click through, but it's pretty low quality. I mean, this person, I mean, if you know anything about Black hair, and especially even Black men's hair, the list of different styles and possibilities, this person has not gone to the barbershop. There is no edge up here. There's no fade. This is unkempt. So this isn't what I would call dignified representation. And some of them are okay. You know, this one's like not a terrible caricature. The hair's, you know, middling quality. But then you have things like this. I see this model and I think, wow, okay, this is what I'm looking for, like these sort of like box braids. But look at sort of what the results come with. We've got a Black woman who's completely nude, spread eagle, and her neck and wrist are bound by rope, right? This is just because I want to put a Black woman and, you know, or Black hair in my game. These are the kind of search results that you get. Again, African-American homeless man. You'll see things like this that just feel so, there's something also really strange about seeing these like Black bodies in a marketplace. Even representation that you think is like, oh, okay, well, this is kind of cute. Like, I like her hair, but why does her shirt just have a watermelon on it? Was this made by a Black person? What's the relationship? There's still this sort of like these caricatures. And then if you look up Afro hair in the Unity asset store, no results, right? So I'm not going to find any Afro hair there. Looking up African American in the Unity asset store, for those of you who don't know, Unity is a free, it's not open source, but it's a free game engine, mostly free for amateurs. It's pretty accessible. It's widely used for both novices and professionals. So, you know, this is a huge resource. This is what you have. The first one is basketball players. Again, you see no women. And then you have things like wild beasts and safari animal packs. So not exactly what I'm looking for. So this is why I decided that I wanted to create the open source Afro Hair Library, to imagine something that was feminist, anti-racist, that was queer, that was the antithesis of all of these sort of white, male, capitalist dominated spaces that have this tech accessible and available to folks. So I want to show you now, I recently got a grant for this project. It's still very new. It's really exciting. But I've been working with one of my students in the other lab. Oh, I haven't talked about the other lab. I run an intersectional feminist space for new media and experimental games and extended realities. It's called the Other Lab, and I'm the founding director. And one of the Other Lab residents, Annabelle Mokenpew, I've been working with her for a bit, and she is a 3D artist. And she started sculpting these, you know, the natural ethnic hair. So I want to show you some of her work. Just thinking about reimagining like these representations that we can have in digital media. So this is some of student work. And then I have a collaborator, H.D. Harris, who I think is on the call right now, whose work is absolutely amazing. And I want to show you some of the work that we're looking to seed the library with. The idea for the open source hair library is that I want to launch it once we have 100 seeded models, and I'm doing that by collaborating with other Black artists. And there's an entire polemic behind this work, but I just want to show you some of these really beautiful images. Yeah, so that's the open source Afro Hair Library, and I think the last thing that I'll say about it is coming back to my own practice and, you know, like I said, thinking about liberation work. For me, the Other Lab and the Afro Hair Library really are forms of social practice. Now that I have some level of privilege and I'm associated with these institutions, you know, I think, how can I open this up to other folks? And I think the reason why I say the open source Afro Hair Library is, you know, social practice, and not social practice just as an aesthetic, but social practice that's really embedded in a community, is that so much of the work is not about just creating this database that is, you know, there and visible and has, you know, dignified representations of Black people. A huge part of the work, maybe the most important part, is building that community of Black creators and making sure that that work is seen and that that work is promoted and that we are, you know, making work that represents ourselves for us, and other people can use it. You know, the fact that it's open source and for use means that, you know, an amateur and a novice could use it, but it also means that, you know, industry-wide, there's no longer the excuse that we don't know how to represent, we don't know how to do it, because it's here and these models will be available. But this project is in early stages, and the idea is that we would grow a community of contributors, but the very first moment is seeding it, like I said, with work from artists of color who are paid for their work. So most of my work here is writing grants to get money to make sure that we are paying like Black creators to make this work, because that's what I think is a meaningful social practice, not just sort of saying, here's the aesthetics of you know, this community, but actually like, what are we doing to build our own networks and highlight each other's works and sort of lift everybody up at the same time. Yeah, so that's my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, AM. That was so wonderful. I have like pages and pages of notes, so I'm going to try to make sense of this and maybe kick it off with some questions. But folks, please write your questions into the chat or raise your hands and I can call on you. So something that stuck out for me was just hearing you think through and speak on the limits of representation, and thinking about our overlapping fields of design and technology and art as just being, as not being just not biased, but the omissions and issues we're seeing can reinforce supremacy and erasure. So in the context of algorithmic bias in particular, I'm thinking about artist and researcher Mimi Onoa and how she actually calls it algorithmic violence. And we see this thinking in Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, and we see it in Simone Brown's Dark Matter. So these challenges are beyond representation, and when problems repeat, right, they're structural and systemic. So it's wonderful to hear that thinking, and you see that in your practice just over time, you moving into the systemic. So I'm wondering, just as a kickoff question, in your work, you use an intersectional feminist lens, and I'm thinking about Kimberly Crenshaw as like maybe that grounding definition, but I'd love to hear from you. How do you define that, and who are maybe other critical race and gender theorists you're pulling from? And then also, in addition, why is it important to apply this lens to your practice?
Oh, that's such a great question. Many questions in there. So my definition of intersectional feminism, I think of intersectional feminism as feminism that takes into account our multiple and intersecting positions, like the multiple ways in which we're marginalized and oppressed, and is really looking at, is not exclusionary, right? Like is really making space for everyone and understanding that this is, that this may be my struggle and I may not be directly impacted by yours, but that I'm in solidarity with you, right? And that I can't have liberation without your liberation, that they're intertwined. I think the reason why it's important to apply that to my practice is like, oh my God. I think for me, I grew up in a space where my values were really shaped to be, it really primed me to sort of embrace neoliberal ideals. And I think about that a lot, especially in the present moment, how much respectability politics went into who I wanted to be and who I was trying to be. I think that, that's not something that I feel shame for, but it's something that I think about a lot because, I will try to make my work, sorry, I'm probably gonna answer this in a roundabout way. But one of the things that I consider in my own intersectional feminist practice is accessibility. And I don't mean accessibility just in terms of like disability, but I mean accessibility in terms of like cultural accessibility. I remember when Lemonade came out, there's this whole critique, Bell Hooks critiquing Beyonce's like form of feminism, this sort of watered down pop cultural capitalist feminism, is that even feminism, et cetera, et cetera. And, I love Bell Hooks, I adore Bell Hooks, but I also think that there's a place for Beyonce's pop cultural feminism. I think there's a place for, BuzzFeed and Twitter hot takes, right? Like, I think there's a place for this pop cultural feminism because, to be honest, I didn't have access to Bell Hooks until I went to UCLA. And how many people get to go to UCLA? I can tell you that in my graduate program, I was the first and only Black woman there. So that's not a lot, right? Like that's not, there's a lack of access there. And so I think so much of my work, which I didn't talk about explicitly, but I think you can see is rooted in pop culture. Like, for example, I'm working on a tabletop game called Yay or Nay, which is guess who, but half of the characters are Black men. No, all of the characters are Black men, half the characters are Kanye West, right? And like, I think about that work because I'm constantly thinking about, I'm the same person now that I was, when I was 12, 14, 17. I still had the same, I was still me, but what I lacked was access. What I lacked was exposure to different resources and bodies of knowledge and thought. And so I think, I tend to take an approach that is very generous and that says, okay, how do I create this work that is culturally accessible to folks who aren't already in the space? And how do I make sure that I'm not sort of, as I gain, there's something that happens, especially in social justice discourse, that is like, sorry, let me close that. It's like, okay, I read this, I had access to this literature last week, or I read this thing last week, and now I'm super woke and my woke level is here, and everybody else has to be here too. And if you're over here, what's wrong with you? Don't you know? Didn't you get the memo? And you know, folks like Adrienne Marie Brown have like called that out, calling out the call out, also very influenced by her work. And so I think for me, like rooting in intersectional feminism means also thinking about class and thinking about accessibility and thinking about how different folks have, you know, there's something that I've said before is that empathy is a luxury, right? Like if you don't have time and space and you don't have basic needs and resources, then, you know, thinking about other people, thinking outside of yourself, your family, or your community feels like a luxury. Yeah, so I guess that's the biggest way it impacts my practice. Sorry, I'm just like rambling. But.
No, I love it. I love all the people that you lifted up also in that answer. I want to go to the chat box. There's a question here about resourcing. There's someone who, Grace says, as an artist, I also have a lot of activism ideas to implement, but how do you pay for living expenses and technology supplies as you were, sorry, people are answering. How do you pay for living expenses and technology supplies as you are building your work? Can you talk through the transition for someone who wants to jump in and create art and activism work financially?
Yeah, so, oh, and the part of that is how do I work and pay collaborators and build I love that question because that's difficult. And I think that also goes into sort of the social practice and the way I'm conceiving of it. So to answer the first half of that question, I'm not a person who comes from privilege. I'm not a person who can go back home and live with my family. Like I don't have that. What I am is a person who's always been very resourceful, and I'm a person who's always taken calculated risks. Right after graduate school, I had the option to get a job. The job I could have gotten that would have paid for my apartment in LA would have been like maybe a social media manager. So I could have taken that job, or I could have said, I'm gonna try to pursue being an artist. Now, already as a person of color without a safety net, having a creative practice is a risk, right? So what I did was I moved out of my rent-controlled apartment. I lived in my car and I couch surfed for months, and I took residencies. And I see Chatham is here because Chatham is one of the folks who gave me a place to stay because I got this residency in Spokane, Washington. So what, you know, and I don't want to glamorize that lifestyle because it is difficult and you can definitely wear out somebody's couch and it is awkward and uncomfortable and you have to have really a support network that you built. But when I didn't have sort of monetary flexibility, I tried to build that flexibility in. So I've always been a person who might say, well, I'm gonna like hoard this little bit of my like funding or whatever not my grant, but like a graduate fellowship or whatever it is. And I'm gonna save that and I'll live in a car and eat ramen because I'd rather have that there so that, for example, if I get a residency, I can pay to travel there. Or I think for the VR piece, for the VR work, not the work you saw, but the way I got into VR was through applying to Oculus Launch Pad. And I was still couch surfing, but as soon as I got into Oculus Launch Pad and I knew that we could make a project to potentially get funding for that work, I rented a room. So I had built in that sort of safety net for myself because I always maximize my resources. I also gave a talk on this at Eastern Washington University when I was living in Spokane that talked about sort of like the 3 baskets that I put my eggs in. Such a weird, but anyway. And it was always sort of independent. So, okay, figuring out what kind of independent things can I do? Like Oculus Launchpad, what kind of programs are out there, using every part of my identity to go into those programs. I have no shame about that. Like, oh, this is a project for women, this is a project for Black people, I don't care, I'm applying to all of it. Also, you know, academic and institutional basket, I have an M.F.A. So I knew that whether I could get a job in the academic market, I at least had the basic qualifications, right, to have a sort of day job. And then the other one I think was, I've sort of forgotten this, maybe corporate. So, oh yeah. So sorry, I've gotten them mixed up. So corporate, like sort of figuring out like, okay, yeah, by taking on these different programs, I have networked, I do meet people. I know a bunch of people at Facebook, right? Like if I wanted to take that turn. And so I have a practice of always planting seeds in a variety of areas because sometimes something's gonna grow, right? So that's my strategy. And I really recommend it for artists because it's like, how else can you live, right? It's so volatile. But I recommend that for everyone because nothing is safe or static in the times that we live in. To answer the second part of that question, like how am I paying people? How am I doing this? this is really interesting and something that I haven't necessarily been able to do in the past. I haven't had a lot of collaboration, in part because I never felt comfortable asking people to work on something that was my vision that I couldn't pay them for. And so I always tried to do things myself, and that did mean that I had to scale down projects and scale down work. But I just always felt as a person who comes from poverty, it just felt so strange to me to ask for other people's time in that way. And I see other people do it and exploit that, and I didn't want to be that person. So now I do have some funds. I'm associated with this research institution. I have some research funds as a professor. I can write grants, I can get money. But even then, you know, the other lab, I'll give you an example. So the way that this typically works, if you are running a lab as a professor, as a part of an institution, you get paid more money. You get funding, maybe you get a staff person, you are paid more of your salary because you're taking on more work. The way that the other lab works is it's just my personal studio. It's a personal studio for me that could just be mine, but instead I knew very clearly, I said, I want to make this a public space. It's not just graduate students working on my work. It is literally a lab that is, I should show it to you. It's like really beautiful. It's designed to be welcoming and warm and like queer and femme coded. And I share with undergrad students and graduate students and outside whoever wants to do that work and is aligned with these sort of like, you know, feminist values. And that's something that I don't have to do, but it's a resource that I have and then I'm able to share, right? Because I have control of that space. So that's one way that I might create opportunities and resources for people, even when I don't have, you know, more funding, more money. The second way is, and so I'm working with two collaborators right now. One is Tajay Keith, who's an amazing illustrator. The other person is H.D. Harris. And the way that I found both of them was to put out a call on Twitter and to follow, you know, different threads for artists of color. So I don't always have like funding. I can't, you know, just spend money and hire someone. And then, you know, the idea of spec work, like having someone make work for your project without paying them just to see if they're good enough, like that's unethical. So I sort of would do this. I would follow an artist for a while. Many of these artists will sometimes have like commissions, and they might be like emergency commissions. They might be cheaper commissions, you know, especially artists of color, you might have bills that come up. We see this on Twitter all the time. So anytime there was a commission that was like sort of within a price range that I could personally afford, I would commission that work. I would usually buy out those commissions and say, hey, I'm considering you for this other project. Can I buy these commissions to see if this might be, you know, maybe we can work together in the future if it works out. There's also something, you know, I think about the ethics of that. Like, well, especially if it's an emergency commission, are you exploiting the artist because clearly, you know, they're in need, right? And now you're using that work. So the way that I approach that is if I know I'm paying a rate that's less than what they will usually charge, I will do low stakes work. So for example, I'll say, hey, here's some artwork that I already have, like my Objectif cards. You can choose whatever you want out of my existing original work, and you choose whatever it is you want to make, because you know how long it's going to take you. If you want to do something that takes you 5 minutes for the same price versus an hour or whatever, you do it. You have that agency and control. I'm not, you know, looking for a specific return. So it's low stakes work, so it allows me to see, can we work together? Does your style fit? And then if that's true, if it works out, then I will go and say, okay, here's some research funds, let's get you in the UC system, and then we'll create a contract and then we'll work together in that way. So I just try to be really transparent and flexible. And I wanna say this is something that's important to me because I've talked often about like being a person, like especially a marginalized person in an institution that just wants your face, but not your experience. And there is a real difference when you are trying to work with other marginalized creators. Like it's not just, oh yay, we're Black and we're queer and it's going to be good times. Like I've collaborated with folks who whose living situations are unstable, who don't have familial support, who have real life shit come up that sort of interferes with our ability to work together. And the response that I have to that, even though it might be easier to work with someone who has more experience or whatever, more stable, you know, sort of professional relationship, the way I pursue that is by making space for folks and by saying, hey, do you need more money? Because it sounds like more money would just solve the problem, right? Like, so let's pay you more. Or maybe we'll miss that deadline and that's okay because, you know, first and foremost, you're a human being who's part of my community. not just like a laborer. So I really try to make these like, accept the reality of collaborating with other marginalized people. Is this not always as easy? And so the way that we make it work is that we make it work.
I want to say thank you to Grace for asking that question. I think it's so important to not only ask artists that visit us questions about their projects conceptually, but also the resourcing, right? The administrative side of that. So I appreciate your answer to that as well. We have like 5 minutes left, but I really wanted to ask you maybe one last question. I'm trying to get in a habit of when I'm meeting with social practice artists, asking them, what do you need? Because there are a bunch of us on this call. I'm curious, just as you're moving forward, what do you need to produce your work? Are you looking for collaborators? What are you working on next? Yeah.
Yeah, so the open source Afro Hair Library started with a very small little dinky grant. And that's when I brought HD on for like kind of smaller work. But just in the last few weeks, I got a Hellman Fellowship. And I applied to some other large grants, so I'm very happy. And I haven't had time in the pandemic. It's like I want to craft the perfect tweet, and I haven't done that yet. But here's the tweet. I am looking for other artists of color to craft beautiful, loving, dignified depictions of Black folks. Like I said, for the open source Afro Hair Library, I have one collaborator right now, but I'm looking for more. So if you know other 3D artists, and you know, this is the kind of work, what I love about the open source Afro Hair Library is that it's also low stakes work. It's available to, you know, I can work with folks at different levels of experience. Like you can see the student work that I'm doing, and then I'm working with HD, who's like just has so many years of experience, is really amazing. Yeah, so I want more brown people, you know, depicting brown people.
Love it.
Say what's up.
Yeah. So just to close, I wanted to give out a couple of shout outs because I know this conversation series is a labor of love. Quickly shouting out Shin, Richard, Sven, and Sam. It's because of all of you that we're able to have amazing speakers like AM come and visit us. Also extending thanks to John and Justin for providing DT program support. Everyone, just let's thank AM for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. And if anyone wants to contact me or follow up, I love talking to friends. So yeah. Also, I'm in pandemic mode, so I'm very lonely. So please talk to me. Please reach out.
Thanks.